In India also we are doing some amount of research and development into the air taxi vehicles. So let us start the presentation. Okay, as far as India's borders are concerned, we are a very large country and we have a border which is extending over 15,107 kilometers. It is huge. And India's maritime border is again 7,517 kilometers. So, given the present scenario, the situation that we have had with China, one can only imagine how hard it is for our military and our internal security apparatus to keep a vigil on the border. It is sometimes next to impossible because you cannot completely seal off a border when you have over 15,107 kilometers of land border and 7,517 kilometers of maritime border. And at times we have to take our chances. So the next slide, you can see the breakup of the border, how it is defined. Even with Nepal, we have about 1,751 kilometers of border. And all this border that we see right from the tip of Jammu and Kashmir all the way down to Myanmar is extremely porous. It is also poorly demarcated and it is fraught with international disputes. There is a lot of cross-border infiltration and the reasons are terrorism related, illegal immigration, narcotic smuggling and other criminal activities. And of course, there is heavy military presence of either country on the other side of the border. And our maritime border also happens to be one of the busiest trade route along the Indian Ocean. It is said that nearly between 40 to 50% of the world trade passes through this maritime border, which is touching India. Now let us come directly to the main topic, that is unmanned aerial vehicles. There is a word being thrown around, drones. Now I would like to bring to your kind attention that the word drone is not the right way to describe a unmanned aerial vehicle. A drone is basically an aerial target which is used for gunnery practice by the military, by the Air Force, by the Navy. And the other drone is an autonomous unmanned aerial vehicle which is able to absolutely on its own able to perform a mission without any human intervention. So that you will find those examples in an Isaac Asimov novel, etc. And now we have some of those vehicles in real life also. So UAVs commonly are known as RPVs, that is remotely piloted vehicles, robot planes, pilotless aircraft, etc. The most distinguishing factor of a UAV is that there is no human operator. It can fly autonomously, but in present circumstances, it is piloted remotely. But there is a pilot who is behind the operation of a UAV and has got all the waypoints loaded in the ground control system, which is guiding the UAV to its target area. Some of these UAVs are expendable or recoverable. When I say expendable UAVs, these are generally targets which are sent for a mission, and once they complete the mission, they either run out of steam, fall out, or they are destroyed. And the ones that come back to its base are recoverable. Those are generally the UAVs that we see today. UAVs also carry a payload which can be lethal or non-lethal. So when we talk about lethal payloads, these are generally munitions, and non-lethal payloads are myriad of payloads. It can be ranging from simple electro-optics to signal intelligence, capability, communications intelligence capability, or a combination of all of the three. And in many times nowadays UAVs are carrying electronic jammers, etc.
Excuse
There's
me,
another.
sir. Sorry
Yes.
to interrupt. Could you please change the screen to presentation mode? It is appearing in PowerPoint screen.
Now,
No, sir. Not
present.
yet.
Okay, got it. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much.
Okay. Now, another interesting tidbit fact about the UAV is that this is a very old technology. This year, the UAV technology turns 100 years old. Just like electric vehicles, UAVs are very old technologies. The first UAV that was used successfully was the AQM-34 Firebee that was used in the Vietnam War. And the first armed flight of a UAV, the Predator, took place in December 20, 2002. So if you see on the right, this is the AQM-34 Firebee. The first that one was used in the Vietnam War. And then you have the Pioneer UAV. This is something that is successfully flown for over 2 decades by Israel, the United States, and including India. And this is the MQ-1 Predator, the famous MQ-1 Predator. Now let us come to the UAV categories. This is very important to understand when you talk about UAVs. The UAVs are basically categorized based on their size, weight, power, and endurance. The size of a UAV can be as low as 250 grams. Some of them are even smaller now, up to 150 grams, where they are able to mimic an insect. These are used by special forces, or at least they are currently being tested for the use by special forces. Or sometimes they are covered with litmus paper and sent into an area where there has been a chemical spill or a gas leak. And once it enters that area, it can check for what kind of chemicals are present in the air, as the litmus paper will change its color. And depending upon the size and weight, you have the power and the endurance of the UAV. Endurance can be as low as say around 20 minutes to ranging for up to 14 to 15 days. That's how long these things can fly. And another most important thing to understand is that a UAV without its payload, that is the sensors on board, is just a toy, is just something that is going, flying and coming back, and there's not much use to it. So it is essentially a power cord that is supplying power to the payloads on board. So it doesn't matter how big your UAV is, it doesn't matter how much endurance your UAV has. All that matters is what kind of combination of payloads you have in the UAV. That is the functions it is able to perform. Now we will see the various UAVs that are categorized. You have the small unmanned aerial system. This is the UAVs that you see currently being flown in the Indian market a lot. Both the civil sector, the commercial sector, and the government sector are making use of this UAV. This UAV is generally used for mapping. So this is a UAV that is fixed wing. You see those wings that are fixed. And then you have a UAV which is called a quadcopter. That is, those 4 propellers are there. And I'm sorry, I forgot to put a picture of that. So 4 propellers are there, and these are used by the local police agencies for crowd control, making public announcements. And in China, that has been very effectively used, and also Spain during the pandemic. In fact, the use of UAV in pandemic fighting has been one of the defining factors, which has led to a lot of regulatory changes in the Indian UAV sector also. And then you also have the micro UAVs. These UAVs are less than say 900 grams. and they are used by R&D agencies, scientific agencies to come up with newer technologies, as these UAVs are used mainly to study aerodynamics, and in some cases they are used for applications also. Recently, India has deployed UAVs for fighting locusts. The Ministry of Civil Aviation hurriedly came up with regulation where the private sector companies did not have to go through a lengthy process of permissions to deploy UAVs in Rajasthan and other states where there was a huge problem of locusts invading the agricultural land. Then the second UAV, the third category of UAVs is called the tactical unmanned aerial system. Now, tactical unmanned aerial systems are UAVs which are about anywhere ranging from 25 to 120 kgs. These UAVs can pack a punch, and they carry multiple payloads. Their endurance are up to 18 to 24 hours, sometimes up to 2 days. They can run on a gasoline engine or heavy fuel engine. And these are deployed by multiple agencies. It can be civil and military. Commercial agency do not deploy such UAVs, not yet. Then you have the medium altitude, low endurance. Now you see this is a very interesting UAV we have in front of us. What they have done is that this is medium altitude, long endurance. So these UAVs can also fly for over 24 hours and carry a very heavy payload. In fact, these are the UAVs that can carry payload for coastal mapping and for also mapping of hilly terrains. And what they've done in this particular system is they have converted an aircraft with a kit. So the aircraft becomes an optionally piloted vehicle, or an OPV, where if there is a need, a pilot can sit, and if there is no, if it has to go on an unmanned mission, then they simply remove the seat, pack it up with sensors and payloads, and make use of that space, and then they send the aircraft up in the air. Then you have the high altitude, long endurance, which is right here. And this is actually one that is being made by China right now. And these UAVs can fly up to a height of 65,000 feet. And in the US, you have called, this UAV is known as the Global Hawk. And they are used for maritime surveillance. And these can fly for up to 72 hours and with a huge, humongous line of sight. Then we come to the unmanned combat aerial vehicle. Now this is where the game is. This is where the technology, artificial intelligence, machine learning, new advanced materials, everything comes together. This is something that is really very hard to do. And what happens is the UAV sits in its bay and it is being fed with data. It is being fed with all kinds of inputs from various agencies. And what the UAV does is it is able to analyze the data and come up with its own instructions and with its own mission planning, and it goes. All it needs is a signal that it is cleared to go, and it takes off, conducts the mission, comes back, and it can give real-time data to the mission controller, or as and when the data has to be extracted from its data bank, that can be done. Now here's the high altitude airship, lighter than air system. This is where this is something in which I worked on, and this is an airship basically, which is the size of a big football field, and it can carry a payload of up to 12,000 pounds. And I had the honor of doing this presentation, not this presentation, but the presentation on high altitude airships in Dr. Kalam's office, President Kalam's office, twice. And I was so thrilled when I was in front of him, and this was years ago. I was barely 30 years old, and this was in 2003. And Dr. Kalam, opened up his own presentation, and he started synergizing as to how we could use this technology for telemedicine. And we did enter into India's first dual-use technology agreement with the Department of Science and Technology. And as it happens with all things great, it fizzled out. It never took off. Well, we will see. At some day it will come back again, and I'll be very happy when that happens. And so a high altitude airship is basically filled with helium. It remains geostationary at 65,000 feet. So when you are at 65,000 feet, you have nearly 750 kilometers line of sight. So if you are on top of, say for example, somewhere in the middle of Rajasthan, say Jodhpur or something, you can see everything all the way up to Rawalpindi. If there is a car starting its engine, you can detect that. That is how powerful this system is. And not only that, this system has got kinetic missiles on board. So a kinetic missile is something which does not, there are no engines on it. So when you deploy a missile from 65,000 feet, it uses gravity to come down, and you can guide it at a very long distance. So that is for missile defense. That is, when you're at that height, you can detect a missile in its boost phase, and you can deploy a kinetic missile and take it out even before the enemy knows that something is hitting them. So this is something that few people know about, but it exists. And we had a chance to get it, and there was some politics about it. We will discuss that later. Then you have a typical UAV mission. A UAV high-level task force overview. You can see the various concept of operations. You have intelligence, reconnaissance, then drones, as I had mentioned. The drone is for target designation and decoys. A decoy is something which mimics to be a fighter aircraft to confuse the enemy. Then a UAV can be used for transportation, extraction, that is MEDI-EVAC. This concept is still being developed. Then you have insertion. You can do electronic warfare, payload delivery, communication. Now Verizon has come up with the technology where you can, Verizon, the phone company, where you can simply send a UAV up with a switching network, and voila, you have a cell phone network on the go. So which can be used during disaster management, when the first thing that gets destroyed is the cell phone network. So very quickly you can send up a switching network on a UAV and set up a communication infrastructure. And one of the application of the high altitude airship technology was just that. We wanted to set up a redundant communication infrastructure in case of a tsunami. And this is something that has got a wide application. And with one airship, you can handle 1 million phone calls per second. That is the capacity of the payload. And I'm talking about 20 years ago, maybe 15 years ago. Now, of course, the technology has changed. So it may be even able to handle more than 10 million phone calls a second. Now let us, okay, now what are the non-military applications? The non-military applications are homeland security, consisting of border patrol, coastline maritime transportation, drug interdiction, law enforcement. In law enforcement now, many countries like Australia and even Ireland are using this for crime scene investigation. So if there is a, say, a criminal or on the run, or a hostage has to be rescued, they turn on the thermal imagers in the night to check for footprints. If somebody has run into the forest, or if there are any anomalies he has left on the scene. So this is being used by the law enforcement. Then of course you have natural disaster, early warning assessment, and also post-impact emergency response. Some of our UAVs developed by, manufactured by private companies in India were extensively deployed after the earthquake in Nepal, and also after the storm surge in Orissa 2 years ago. A lot of the disaster was studied with the help of UAVs. And then it is also used for monitoring. That is, if you are building a bridge, if you are building a road, you can do infrastructure monitoring, how much concrete has been poured. So the top official who's in charge, say, for example, the National Highway Authority of India, the head, the chairman, can actually get a real-time imagery of how much work has been done on site. So these are very important tools today for monitoring. And then, of course, you have oil and gas industry is using it for monitoring of terminals, refineries, etc. And then extensive application for oil and hazardous substances spill. When there is an oil spill, a UAV will be sent over the oil spill, and it has got hyperspectral images on board, which is a payload. It's a special camera, and it is able to detect what kind of the changes in color in a water body or in a land area where the oil has been spilled, and what action need to be taken, and how much area has been covered by that spill. Then you have wildfire, forest fire, search and rescue, wildlife monitoring, agriculture. I have just mentioned that in agriculture, apart from fighting locusts, they are being used for spraying pesticides, insecticides, and also for smart agriculture applications. I mean, the applications are so huge today, the civilian applications, that I probably fill up 20 slides. So it is just not possible for me to discuss everything. These are some of the important ones, or rather I would say this is just the tip of the iceberg. Now, when we talk about border reconnaissance, three important terms have to be understood. One is intelligence, reconnaissance, and surveillance, which is what is called ISR. So when you talk to people in the military intelligence, or people who are part of RAW, or any other organization, similar organization that is studying a whole lot of imagery, this is something that they constantly talk about, ISR activity. So intelligence is basically a holistic approach that focuses on gathering, analysis, protection, and dissemination of information about the enemy, terrain, and weather in an area of operations or area of interest. Reconnaissance is basically more limited. It is an inspection or exploration of an area to gather information. So, when we talk about an entire border, a Chinese border, the reconnaissance would say of a valley. So it is just that spot that is being surveilled, and important aspects are being learned about what changes have taken place, what are the anomalies that have taken place, has there been a shift in soil. It is called anomaly detection. So if there has been a shift in soil, you can see that somebody has placed something underneath it. It could be an IED or some sort of a sensor or things of that nature. Then you've got surveillance. Surveillance is basically, it also involves people. You understand the behavior of people, or if there is some vehicle that is present there, and how it is behaving, what is it being used for, etc. And these activities need not be just restricted to defense. They can also be equally used for defense, civil, and commercial applications. Like, for example, there's going to be a lot of drones are going to be used in the near future by companies such as Flipkart, Amazon, for delivery, and for them, they also have to enter into an sort of an ISR activity to understand the terrain, to understand a particular area, to understand people's behavior. Because if you're going to be landing drones in an urban area, you need to understand how people behave around a landing area, how people behave around when a drone is landing. At some point, people will get used to it. A drone landing or taking off will be just as common as somebody parking a scooter or a car. But we haven't reached that. So all these things have to be learned, and all this data will be captured and put in a software which is run by artificial intelligence, and they will be machine learning. So the machines will know how to act and react as per whatever data it receives and collates and analyzes. Then some of the major payloads that are being used today by the UAVs are right here. You have the electro-optic. This is just a simple camera, like the camera you have on your phone. Then you have an IR camera that is infrared. Then you have a low light television camera. So this is a little bit more expensive camera. When there is the light is kind of fading during sunset, it is very hard to capture imagery, and that's where some of the changes in military guard and positioning and formations take place. So it's very important to have this kind of camera. Then you have hyperspectral imagers. These are, as I had mentioned, used for a whole variety of applications. Then you have for the military, you have signal intelligence, you have very large payload, you have payloads for communication relay. Like I mentioned, it can create an alternative redundant communication infrastructure. So if there is a platoon that is going for a mission, it can have its own communications relay infrastructure. Then these can be used as decoys. I had mentioned drones, they go in as aerial targets, or the same thing can mimic an aircraft and confuse the enemy. The enemy will think that there is an aircraft coming towards it, but it is actually a cheap aerial target, which is mimicking that it is a big fighter aircraft. And then that same particular aircraft can also carry a jammer. It can jam enemy radio signals and electronics to provide an opening for our troops to get in. So that's also a very important application. Then, of course, a drone can carry weapons. You can see there is a bomb on board in this drone, it can also be used for counter IEDs. For example, it can carry certain payloads which can detect IEDs, although these are very hard to do, you have to use a very advanced multispectral camera, but still they are now trying to get the holy grail of being able to understand the holy grail of being able to detect IEDs that are buried under the ground. Presently, you have to use a ground penetrating radar to detect it, but I think very soon they will be able to use UAVs and detect things that are buried under the ground. Then, of course, they are being used for resupply also. Ammunition can be given to units that are in a combat zone. Then they can provide all kinds of tactical linkages, and as well as medi-evac facility also. In the civilian areas, you have agricultural, law enforcement, flash shot detection. If there is a gunshot, a UAV in the air can detect where that came from. And then you have PSYOPs. This is another important application. This time China used it very effectively during the pandemic fighting. A lot of people were simply, roaming around the market area aimlessly, and the UAVs with their loudspeakers on came down and started telling people that what they were doing was wrong, and it was important that they go back, and how this disease was not going to spare anyone. So it put the fear of God in them, and they were able to get a handle on it. Now it is also important. See, before you talk about UAVs. Every UAV has got a concept of operations. Whenever you talk, even a small UAV which is 250 grams has got a ConOps behind it. A large UAV which is a Global Hawk has got a ConOps behind it. Without a ConOps, it's just pointless to have something like this. So what is a ConOps? It is basically a document describing the characteristics of a proposed system from the viewpoint of a user. And it is used to communicate quantitative and qualitative systems characteristic to all stakeholders. And also it is sort of I would say, instruction manual which describes how a UAV has to be put to use. It gives a very detailed. It's a detailed flow chart basically. Of course. Once you get into the nitty-gritty of it, it runs into a big whole book. But a ConOps on the surface is basically a flow chart. So on your right, you can see a joint medical distance support and evacuation ConOps. You know how a UAV receives a signal and then it finally is able to reach. It is all autonomous. Reach the affected party here, which is a soldier, and it takes him, and then it takes him back to the ship. So, this is what is a ConOps. Now let us come to the main meat of the matter, that is the border security. UAVs have been deployed by the United States since 2005 for border security. The aircraft or the UAV that is doing this job is called the Predator B. So Predator B is the version that is for government and civilian application. It has got sensors on board. It is not armed at all, and it is used for border monitoring, tracking, and interception. And it is used both on the northern side of the border and southern side of the border of the United States. And then there is a special UAV called the Guardian, which is used for anti-narcotics trafficking operations. So there are plenty of narcotics coming from via sea into the United States and also via land. So this is able to detect and able to pinpoint, and the drone itself is not able to stop anything. Ultimately, what has to happen is the drone will detect a target and it will loiter on it. So if there is a boat, say, filled up with narcotics or illegal immigrants that are moving into the United States, in our case, this can be deployed very effectively alongside the Gujarat coast and also along the West Bengal and Bangladesh coast. There's a lot of smuggling going on. And you know what happened in the November 2008 attacks in Mumbai. It came from the ocean, and had that boat been detected, a simple boat that from where 10 of these terrorists came in, the UAV simply would have locked on to that boat and loitered on top of it, hovered on top of it for hours on end, and it would have sent the message to the Coast Guard or the Navy. And the Navy would have sent a helicopter, a manned asset, and they would have been able to get the situational awareness for actionable intelligence. So now this is a typical. This is a bit cluttered. I'll show you a different diagram. Now this is a Global Hawk. How it performs its mission. You can see at 65,000 feet, it loiters for 24 hours. And then there is a sensor coverage area. It is almost 40,000 square miles. That's the amount of area it can cover. Now, you don't need to have such a large UAV all the time. You can use a tactical UAV, which I had talked about a little earlier. A tactical UAV has got an endurance for 24 hours and it can do the job. And it also costs much less than a Global Hawk. We don't need Global Hawk, although we may need Global Hawks at some point. So these systems are very expensive. Global Hawk probably may cost up to $1 billion. So that is what it does. Let me come down. Now, this is a simple ConOps for oil spill, which I had mentioned before. You can see the small quadcopter can come, detect the oil spill, and then it can give signals to the unmanned surface vehicle, that is the boats that are there. And then there is a mothership here. Then the mothership can deploy personnel to go and check on the oil spill or the status of the oil spill. Then you can see the hyperspectral imager, how it works. See, there has been an industrial accident here, and this is the image taken by a hyperspectral imager. So it can see, you can see the changes in color which the hyperspectral imager has taken. So the engineers will be able to understand what exactly has spilled into the ocean floor and what needs to be done to clean that up, or how severe, depending upon the refraction, how severe the oil spill has been. And this is some example of a pipeline monitoring, etc. Okay, now let us come to the uh, three most important. Why do we need UAVs? UAVs are first of all unmanned, so that is the only advantage because they can perform dull, dirty, and dangerous jobs. So when you say dull, what is dull? Dull is loitering or flying over a target area continuously for over days. It is simply not possible for a manned aircraft to do it. It will be very tiring, and your forces will become tired. So you need them for other operations. You probably need them for combat. So UAVs can take over that role. And today, given India's situation, deteriorating situation along the border, including with Nepal now, we need what is called persistent surveillance. Persistent surveillance is that no matter what, I am going to be there. My asset is going to be up in the air, looking at you 24/7, 365 days of the year. No matter what, I am going to be there. So if you have to maintain eyes in the sky, you have to perform the dull job of persistence surveillance. Persistent surveillance leads to situational awareness. Lot has been said, oh, we didn't know how when these guys got in. Some people say, no, we had information, whatever. If you have assets in the air constantly, you have situational awareness. When you have situational awareness, you have actionable intelligence. If you miss a small bit here or there, you don't have the situational awareness. Even if you have the situational awareness, actionable intelligence is long gone. The damage is already done. So that is what the dull job is. Now, second is dirty. Now, what do you mean by dirty? Dirty is, I just mentioned, for example, a gas leak or say, for example, a explosion in an oil refinery or say a wildfire that is taking place. There's too much smoke. It is absolutely not possible for manned intervention to take care of, to take stock of the situation. So in that sense, the UAVs are perfect. They simply go in because it is unmanned. You don't have the fear for someone losing their life. And these were used in surveys for Fukushima nuclear power station also. Then comes the dangerous part. Now, a lot is being said by the China analysts, anti-access, area denial, A2AD ops, and it is so hard. The Chinese have made it very hard, and there is always a way to get into the fight. Whether the enemy is big or small, powerful, or he has his defense absolutely packed in, there is always a way in. And once you have a way in, you are in the fight. And UAVs give that opening. Fine, you have a bubble around your anti-access area denial area. I will send in my UAVs. I will send in my UAVs at 65,000 feet. 65,000 feet is the stratosphere, that is near space. I'm well above your bubble. I will see what you're doing, where your assets are. I will see where the gaps are, and I will get in. So that is what is called, how you get into the anti-access area denial. And if you remember, the RQ-170 was one UAV that the Americans were flying over Iran, because Iran has also got a very tight air defense and they don't let any other asset come close to them, which can be targeted. So the RQ-170 was being flown on top of Iran. And similarly, Global Hawk is flying over South China Sea. I think the Australian version of it, I think probably Japan also has got it, so their version of it and the American version of it. So there are three types of Global Hawk flying over the South China Sea, picking up enormous amounts of data. See, another issue with UAVs is that yes, you have a great system, you have a great sensor package flying on top, but you know the amount of data that comes into you, come to you is in itself becomes a problem. What do you do with so much of data? So that's another field of study where you remove, segregate the noise and get only that amount of data which is to be used for situational awareness, and then finally even more sifting for actionable intelligence. So that is dull, dirty, and dangerous. Then let us talk about what is the main advantage of deploying UAVs for border ISR activities. So, you know, number one, it's a force multiplier. It improves coverage along remote sections, real-time imagery for situational awareness. See, everything that the UAV does is real time, real time, real time. Even if it was doing something 2 hours post, we don't need that. There's no need for that. Then, of course, it has got a better tracking capability and stationary sensors, and the addition of synthetic aperture radar and MTI indicator significantly increases the capability. And then you have the the military the signal intelligence payloads that can again multiply the effectiveness of UAVs. So the UAV is essentially a truck. You know, it is just a truck or a bus. It is the payload which makes it effective. In India we have the Heron UAV for which we paid through our nose. It's a very, very, very expensive system, but it is also a very good system. Very little comes, detail comes out about the Heron, and I think the forces would like to keep it that way, which is a good thing. The Navy has got its own set of Herons, and the Air Force has also got its own set of Herons. The Army does not have Herons. The Army has to requisition its Herons from the Navy and the Air Force, but the Army has got Searchers. It's a different UAV, again purchased from Israel. Another thing that I would like to tell you is that India is the largest importer of UAVs in the world. I think we have a market of about 19 to 23% of the import market is captured by India, which is not something of pride. What are the main advantages again for deploying UAVs for border ISR? So extended range of a UAV puts less burden on human resources. It's far quieter than conventional aircraft. This may be true or may not be true because UAVs themselves, a quadcopter, if it is flying 50, 60 feet above your head, it's a pretty noisy affair. But I don't know, the UAV community likes to call it that way. Fine, I will use it. Then yes, this is absolutely important. Low cross section avoids detection. You need to have some really good sensitive radars to catch a UAV. And if your UAV is made of carbon fiber, then it becomes a problem detecting it. Even if you have detected it, it becomes a problem targeting it. So yes, low cross section avoids detection, which is true. Then we come to maritime patrol. This is a real big force multiplier. And it's a very expensive system also. It is not cheap. As I had mentioned earlier, maritime patrol UAVs are almost the size of a 767 Boeing aircraft, if not bigger. The wingspan is definitely much longer. What happens is that suppose you buy this aircraft, it's not just the price of the aircraft, it is the redundant infrastructure that you have to set up for this aircraft. You have to have a special airport for this aircraft. It has to be a dedicated airport. It cannot be used by other manned airports. It can be, but generally the system requires that it is a dedicated airport. And then I will come to, in the next slides, I will show you how many people are behind a UAV. And so, these are used for survey of economic exclusion zones. When we talk about, the Gulf of Aden and the Malacca Strait, to keep an eye on that, this is something that we would need. Although we have a huge fleet of Poseidon aircrafts, maritime patrol aircrafts, which are doing a fantastic job. But I think a couple of these should be, adding more teeth as far as our naval surveillance is concerned. And they would be complementary to the existing fleet of aircrafts. See, one more point that I would like to make is that UAVs are not replacement to any existing system. A lot of people, think that, why don't you fly a UAV? Why don't you fly a UAV for that? No, UAVs are not going to replace systems. They are not going to replace satellites. They are not going to replace manned aircrafts. They are complementary. Yes, when I say that UAVs are the future of manned aviation, that is a time that is still 20 to 2 decades away. They will replace them eventually. But at this present juncture, UAVs are complementary to the existing platforms. And a lot of data is available online. A lot of research papers are available online, written by scholars on how effectively they have performed various concept of operations in the military and for R&D, for a whole lot of applications. UAVs have been used. What is the business case? So if you can see on your left is a small quadcopter, the one with the 4 propellers, and then on the right you have the helicopter. So if you see the platform cost, one cost $60,000, which is again come down cheaper. And this is some old data here. And then you have, this is $7.5 million. Mission time 30 minutes, mission time 2 hours. Now see, this is where the cost difference comes in. You have one operator and you have 2 crew plus 2 observation people who are there for. And then you have to have a big support maintenance. Here support is minimal. So this is the business case one where the UAV becomes cheaper. Now what are the limitations? Limitation is that very high accidents rates for UAVs, multiple times, 100 times that of manned aircraft. Now this is now coming down as we speak, as UAVs are becoming more and more sophisticated, as UAVs have got more sensors on board, which are able to identify friend and foe, which are able to identify hurdles, which can move around hurdles, which are now being piloted by LiDAR, which have got advanced sensors. So this accident rate has come down. Now the whole point is that UAVs is something that can have an accident because you're not going to lose any life. So that is why we are using UAVs. What happens is that the development cost of an aircraft comes down significantly if there is no crew sitting on it. Crew safety is what adds the cost of an aircraft, to the cost of an aircraft. You have to save the people sitting inside. You have to make the aircraft weatherproof. You have to keep the pilot safe. You have to keep the crew safe. You have to keep the passengers safe. And that's what makes it very expensive. No such cost is there for an unmanned aerial vehicle. And then remote pilot in UAV is less susceptible to wind speed. So landing is difficult. Landing in difficult weather conditions is harder to judge in UAVs. So yes, some operational difficulties are also there, but now as technology is improving, these are also now being ironed out. And of course, yes, this is very true. Inclement weather conditions can hamper the sensor package in a UAV, which is also true in an aircraft also, manned aircraft also. But in the manned aircraft, the option is there to because it is carrying a heavier sensor package, they have a better option of switching to a different sensor payload altogether. And small unmanned aerial systems like the Netra or the one that you see right here, can be flown only at visual line of sight. Visual line of sight is that as how far as your eye can see, which is maximum 1 kilometer or a little bit beyond that. Now, as far as the limitation is concerned, if you see that the cost of operation for large UAVs, like the ones we discussed, like the tactical UAV or the Global Hawk, it is almost double that of the manned platform. And you will see in the upcoming slide why it is. And you also require significant logistical support, which is required for tactical class UAVs. That is, all UAVs which are above 45 kgs and up are very expensive to operate. This is something that people who do not know much about UAVs must know. So anytime you see somebody giving a general statement like, oh, you know, we can do this much cheaper with a UAV, no, it is not always true. Small UAVs, the quadcopters or the small fixed UAVs, which are called SUAS, yes, those are cheaper. But as the UAVs become heavier, they become very expensive to operate. So UAVs also have a high life cycle cost and offset due to long endurance. We'll come to that also. Now see, you can see limitations. Operating one UAV, that is the medium altitude long endurance. That is the one I talked about, which flies up to 20 hours, 24 hours. It requires a crew of up to 20 support personnel, which is much larger than a helicopter. Unless UAVs are built into the CONOPS of the agencies operating on the ground, its effectiveness will be limited. So that means you cannot bring in UAVs as a side tool. If there is an agency that needs UAVs, it must be a vertically integrated arm of that agency. So the Coast Guard should have a UAV core in its operations, which only does UAVs. Only then the cost of operations will come down. It cannot outsource it. It cannot requisition it from other, like the Navy or the Air Force, because it will, they will charge them full money for it and they will have to pay. So now this is the organizational chart of a UAV. Now, this is the UAV. You have the pilot, you have the sensor operator, then you have the mission control, you have the other ground control stations, you have intelligence support, you have the LRE here, you have the support unit here. So all these things, you can see one bird here requires so many people to operate. Now you will be asking me, then why have UAVs? Well, the whole question is, when you want something persistent to be surveilled at any given point of time, 24/7, 365 days, then this is what it takes. Now, as UAVs become smarter, as artificial intelligence and machine learning becomes more and more commonplace, this will reduce to nearly half. Now, let us see. Okay, now the border, if you look at the border security agencies of India, we have about, BSF has got about 185,000 personnel. The Central Board of Excise and Customs has got 8,000, like that. So we have a pretty significant, personnel size. If we look at our paramilitary units, they run into many thousands. And amongst all of this, if you see right now, the borders BSF and the CRPF are the ones that are using, UAVs in a effective manner. And all the other peoples are yet to incorporate UAVs in a big way. Now in India, we have, the Searcher Mark II, which is the UAV which is used by the army for border reconnaissance. And then this was the UAV that we made in India locally, which is very old now. It's called the Nishant. It did not work very well. We spent a lot of money on it, but the results were not very good. But now also the DPSUs have made another UAV which has not given the proper results. Let's go down. Now this is the holy grail. This is called the Wide Area Airborne Surveillance Systems, or the Gorgon stare, as we say. Now, India has now requisitioned the US to, give a proposal for the purchase of these Reaper drones. So, what makes it so effective is that it has got all these multiple sensors on board, and it is able to surveil an area of 4 kilometers in radius. And it need not fly on top of it. These sensors can be mounted sideways also. So when you have sensors that are mounted sideways, so the UAV can be flying inside your own territory and at the same time looking at the enemy territory far inside and giving a very good view of what is happening. So this is what most likely is going to come into India's arsenal, the Wide Area Airborne Surveillance Systems, or the Gorgon stare. This has been with the US for some time now. It's quite for a number of years, but as the technology is improving, the sensors are becoming more and more powerful. Now, this is the business case too I was talking about. So if you see the Predator B versus the US-60 Black Hawk. So here the platform cost is 4.5 million, per platform. Here it is 8.6 million. Mission time is 30 hours, mission time is 2 hours. Trainees 2 operators, trainees 2 crew plus 1 observation crew. Then this is where the whole game changes. You have maintenance 20 plus in 1 operation cell, and here you have about 2 or 3 people. So deployment of UAVs is a very carefully orchestrated game. It should not become a financial burden to the agency that is using it. And if at all it is going to deploy it, it has to get the maximum out of it. So that is why I say that if you're going to use such big platforms, use the hell out of it. There is no point in keeping the more an big aircraft sits on the ground, a truck is parked in the parking lot, you lose money every minute, every hour of the day. So these platforms have to be in the air. If you can't keep it in the air, don't buy it. Then use the existing manned platform. In conclusion, integration of the UAVs with Indian border security agency CONOPS must happen. It has not happened in a big way. The BSF is still using small UAVs. And let me tell you, they are using UAVs which are made in China also, but hopefully not anymore. BSF and Indian Coast Guard and other dedicated border security agencies should have dedicated assets. And more importantly, development and manufacturing of UAVs and related sensors should happen in India. This would bring the cost down. If you import it, the costs are going to be always multiple times higher. The Herons that we get for India have a markup of 4 to even 500%. And we don't have any, leeway in the maintenance, repair, or overall of the system. Even if a screw falls out, you have to call somebody from the source country and get it repaired. And that takes about a week. So serviceability becomes a major issue when you import such expensive systems from abroad. Now, what is the Indian scenario? India has made good progress in terms of policy and regulation in the last 2 years. I must commend this present government. They have really done a lot for the UAVs in terms of regulations. They have made life a lot easier for Indian private sector companies to get on with the manufacturing and operations of UAVs. Although there is still a lot of ground to cover. And nearly all agencies, state government, central government agencies are advocating or have deployed UAVs. And India is still the largest importer of UAVs. And what I say is that in order to give India a boost in this sector, Indian firms should be given the first right of refusal. If an Indian firm is able to give you a UAV within a specified period of time, then that should be given the first right of refusal. Do not give the RFI to foreign OEMs. Otherwise, we will be left behind because foreign companies have had a head start in UAVs. They make great UAVs and they will beat us. because they have the volume. A lot of these UAVs are simply lying packaged in boxes. Like for example, after the US got out of Afghanistan and Iraq disengaged, a lot of their equipment was paid for and kept in boxes. Now those things will be simply sold to us. They will just make twice the amount of money, and they may even loss lead and sell it to us. So that is one problem. So we have to be very careful. We have to give Indian firms the first right of refusal. Yeah, and now India is way, way, way behind China in the design and development of UAVs. If you have heard of DJI Phantom, it's a fantastic company. I mean, they make great UAVs. Some of the best commercial UAVs are made by DJI. Their software is great. Everything is just beautiful about it. And I say this with a pinch of salt. It's just great. And a lot of operators in India use, DJI Phantom UAVs, and DJI Phantom has got is the largest UAV commercial UAV manufacturing company in the world, and I think they also make military UAVs, probably for Chinese military, and I'm sure that they are very good. China also has got the Wingloon UAVs, which is a medium altitude, long endurance armed UAV, which has been successfully deployed by Saudi Arabia. It's a great UAV, cheap also and very effective. And China has also been able to perform what is called a remote split operation. So a remote split operation is when you hear, yes, a pilot eating French fries in Alabama, going on a bombing mission in Afghanistan. That is what is called a remote split operation. It's very, very, very hard to perform. China was able to perform it just a few years ago, maybe years ago, and so they are way ahead of us when it comes to unmanned aerial vehicles. They also have hybrid vehicles which go hydrogen also. So then, our small UAVs have got long endurance. So anyway, let us not talk about China too much. Design and manufacture of UAVs in India is suited for the private sector better than the DPSUs, because this sector requires a lot of out-of-box thinking. A lot of we have to make alliances, get tech partners, and which is more possible, better suited for a private sector company than for a DPSU, which is more traditional in its thinking. So I feel that DPSUs that are manufacturing aircrafts or combat systems, etc., should stick to their side of the business. Let the UAVs be done by private sector companies. Unless they are making very large UAVs like the Global Hawk, which requires a great deal of capital investments, I think DPSUs should stay away from manufacture of small UAVs. Now, in India, UAV infrastructure such as testing facilities and drone corridors, etc., must be put in place to reduce the time of development. So unless you have a dedicated infrastructure, where the young companies, startups can come and test their products, it will be very difficult to do design and development on time, especially, test the UAV under varying conditions. So this is something that we have, the UAV community has pushed for very hard, and the government has listened to us, and the Ministry of Defense is putting in place some testing infrastructure also. And now, as I had mentioned, that without a payload, a UAV is just a toy, it's just a power cord, meaning that sensor technology must be given extra importance. It's a game of sensors, ladies and gentlemen. Network-centric warfare that is already, most modern armies have. It's a game of sensors. And sensor technology is very closely guarded. It is not given away. You may get it piecemeal here and there, but no one will teach you how to put together a whole sensor. So this is something that we need our industry to start doing. Even if they start from scratch, we need to have our own sensors. And doing it, and UAV will provide the best platform to test your sensors. Ultimately, a lot of these sensors that go into UAVs also go into tanks, into armored vehicles, into aircrafts, into guns, and all kinds of things. They are just calibrated differently for the different weapons platform, but sensor technology is the holy grail of modern warfare. We need to have self-sufficiency in this. Then I also say that unmanned aviation is the future of aviation. Unmanned systems is the future of aviation. Education must begin at school levels in India to identify the best talents in this field at an early stage. And if you see school kids around UAVs, my God, they are so happy around this, around UAVs. They love it, and it's the young people who are going to show us the way, because as you grow older, you know, your thinking gets a bit fossilized. It's the young who will tell us what are the new concept of operations that they have been thinking of, how to solve a problem differently. So this is something that we should introduce in school even as a hobby. Now AI and machine learning autonomous systems are intricately designed and linked with UAV technologies. Therefore, an advancement in this sector will automatically lead to the advancement in other sectors. So, when you try to make a UAV autonomous by incorporating AI, machine learning, etc., there are a lot of spillover effects which can be used in other areas also. So, this is something that we have to keep in mind and work towards. And finally, you know, I would like to conclude by saying that along with the development of UAVs, we have to develop the infrastructure that are going to help the UAVs, which means that the new buildings that are being constructed, the smart city programs that are being put in place, you know, the new government initiatives that are being taken, all must find a place for UAVs. UAVs is also going to provide great amount of employment opportunity. Look, one UAV has got a power source in it. It has got a sensors package in it. It has got a aerostructure in it. It has got materials in it. So, you know, everything has to be manufactured. So there will be employment. So a lot of you know, the more the number of sectors employing UAVs, the greater will be the chance for generating large-scale employment. So I would like to conclude by saying that India has got a long way to go in the UAV sector, but the government has been very proactive in the last 2 years, and also the young people with the various startups have been very active, and some more regulatory clearances are required, and I think they are coming soon. Thank you very much.
Fantastic.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, Siddharth. You have taken almost a quarter of an hour beyond the 1 hour that we had thought it might lead, because initially you said 20 minutes and it went up to an hour and then past the hour also. But it was a fascinating presentation. Thank you so much. I'm sure everybody would have loved it. Now, you have given us so much information, I don't know where to begin. But I would like to ask you one thing. You have left out perhaps, but firstly, the question about swarms of UAVs.
Yeah.
Right? Could you perhaps tell us something about that?
Yeah. So, okay, the swarming is, okay, it's a very, if you look at what happened in Saudi Arabia, the Houthis rebels, or freedom fighters, I would like to call them, they launched about 30-40 small UAVs packed with explosives, and they sent it to the oil field refinery, and it went up in flames. So it's a very, it's a cheaper way of overwhelming the air defenses of an enemy. Now, swarming is something that is being studied by the Indian Air Force. In fact, they had detailed discussions with private sector industries on how to go about doing swarming. Um, so when I say swarming, it's very important to first understand in what area we are using swarming for. Is it for military applications or is it for civilian applications also? Now, when you say swarming, that is where the ability of one UAV to talk to the other UAVs that are in the air. Easier said than done. When you have to do a surveillance of a large area very quickly, you have to send in swarms of UAV. So I would say that this is, I didn't leave it purposely. I just feel that India is not yet ready for swarming tactic. If you want, see the swarming tactic that was used by the Houthis on the Saudis will not work against our enemies. They are very much advanced. They would understand that very quickly. Even our Western neighbor has got a bloody good UAV industry. I say that with a pinch of salt. Both China and our Western neighbors, they are very good. In fact, during the Kargil war, they were, surveying they had surveillance on our forces using their UAVs. So it is not going to work. So if we have to develop swarming tactics, it has to be at a very advanced stage. Right now, I feel that we have to get the basic infrastructure up before we can study advanced tactics like swarming. So it can be done. I'm not saying that it cannot be done. It can be done very quickly also. But let us not lose focus, and get into something that for which the application in the present scenario is very little. In a battlefield scenario, yes, we may have to use it. We can rig it up at that point of time. But right now, we have to have the bigger picture in mind and see to it how systems can talk to each other. That's my take on it.
Since you said that it also has civilian applications, do you think we should perhaps focus on that? And perhaps that would also give you an insight into how to later on go on to military applications.
Yeah. Okay. So now here's the thing. See, in India, we are all working in silos. Okay. One company, one UAV operator is here, another UAV operator is there, fourth guy is there, fifth guy is here. When I say infrastructure, we have to get everybody together. The infrastructure should support all operators plugged into one infrastructure. That is the integration of UAVs into the airspace. That is the unmanned traffic management system. See, now I don't want to overwhelm you with too much of data here. So that's when, the entire UAV, all different systems, different UAVs can move in an airspace together. It's just like an aircraft, Boeing aircraft, Airbus aircraft, made by different companies, different airlines, different countries are integrated in one airspace. So yes, like for example, locust fighting, a lot of operators are there. Now, if at all, we can put them all under one umbrella of infrastructure, like a universal unmanned traffic management system. It is called UTM. We can get the data and then apply it for military applications also. So that is something that can be done. You are right. We can try it on a civilian level and translate into military applications.
Sir, please unmute yourself, sir. LVK, sir.
Also, can you tell us something about how to switch from land to the sea? For instance, underwater unmanned vehicles. How easy would it be? Of course, there is a lot of problem about the environment and communications and sites and things like that. But I think we probably need also underwater unmanned vehicles. Is there something being done about it?
Yes, amongst all the three arms of the military, Navy is probably the most well put together. They have a program that is already on. There are a couple of companies in Mumbai that are doing a fantastic job. It's only a matter of time then when they become bigger in scale and start doing bigger things. Right now, the Indian Navy is absolutely looking into unmanned surface vehicle and unmanned underwater vehicles. So there are two aspects to it. In fact, I think surface vehicles are also of equal importance than underwater vehicles. So yes, the Indian Navy is very actively looking into it. I don't think we are importing anything from any other country, but we are domestically looking at generating technologies, which is the right approach by the Navy. Kudos to the Navy on that.
Yeah. That reminds me, I've heard about startups from IIT graduates. I think there are two UAV manufacturers who are actually from this IIT Bombay and perhaps one from IIT Kanpur.
Yeah.
Now, are there perhaps courses being given in these institutes on UAVs?
Yeah, so that is when I said that the government has been very proactive. What I meant was that earlier the policy was so defeatist. They had said that only flight training organizations can impart UAV training. So that just defeats the purpose. You have flying schools that are doing it. If they want to do it, they will do it. If they don't want to do it, they won't do it. But now the new draft regulations, CAR regulations, has said that we are going to allow government recognized educational institutions to also start flight training, UAV flight training curriculum. So yes, so this is a big, good start, for UAV pilot training programs, courses. And I would say that as far as the theoretical portion is concerned, anybody can teach it. There's not a big deal about it. But yes, when there is a field, training required, you need a clearance from the DGCA. They may have certain requirements. That is, the trainers who are teaching the kids or the pilots to fly, they should be certified. It is just like a pilot taking off. He has to know everything that is in the air. He has to inform the ATC, the whole 9 yards. So this training should be there. So yes, this happened. The change in regulation happened about 3-4 weeks ago. So yes, we are moving in the right direction. We have to make up for a lost ground.
About regulations again, I've heard that while the indigenous manufacturers may have this no permission, no takeoff capability, but imported UAVs do not have that. Is there something done about that?
No. I don't think that is. I don't think there is anything. No, there is no. I don't think there is any confusion like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I think I would like to ask some of the other well-learned persons to ask questions and perhaps also share their own observations. Perhaps Rajsenan could chip in. Rajsenan?
Please unmute yourself, Rajsenan. Just unmute yourself.
Yeah.
Here we go.
I have.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
My name is Rajesh Senan and I'm a aerospace engineer retired. One of the sad parts of your presentation is India has missed the bus. I mean, for a UAV technology, sensor technology, and all these modern technologies, you need an educational system that will train people and produce results. Am I right? Even today, if we want to go and produce something on our own, we can't do it. I can't hear you. Excuse me.
You're 100% right.
We are good at so many things, but this is one area where we have missed the bus, and we have to go back and get the educational systems like all the IITs, all the regional engineering colleges working on this. I mean, you have to teach the people all these technologies. I mean, the young people, yes, they will come up with their ideas, but somebody has to teach them something. You can't expect them to come up with things out of nowhere.
No, you are right, 100% right. When I say that, I wouldn't call it, see, if I say we have missed the bus completely, that would be very defeatist on my part.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah,
Huh.
yeah. I have already said that we are way behind China in terms of UAVs. Their products are very good, cheap and fantastic. They work. But the whole point is that this is one sector of aerospace when I say that it is not manned. Okay. So this is something that is, I wouldn't say easier, but it's more doable than flying 100 people inside an aircraft. Okay. I hope you understand what I'm trying to
Yeah, I understand. And I also
Yeah.
mentioned somewhere, we do have organizations that can do it. Nobody is talking about HAL. HAL has been building aeroplanes and helicopters for ages on end. What stops them from going into the automation field and trying to automate these devices?
So I think HAL should stick to only aircraft. We have seen their UAVs. They are not even worth talking about. They are absolute. It's a sad tale. It's like, okay, for example, not everyone can manufacture a boat. When you go and talk to people in Goa shipyard or GRSC, the shipbuilders will tell you that this is something that should be there in your blood. It doesn't matter what a great shipyard you build. If it's there in your blood, you can put together a good ship which will go on the water. UAVs is something that today is there. It's a game for the private sector. It is a game for the young people because it is no longer about aerostructure. It is about making an intelligent aerostructure which is able to do the job and in which you are able to identify various concepts of operations. HAL sadly is not able to think outside the box. They have the best tooling in the place. They have access to the best materials in place, but they have a very traditional way of thinking. They are a build to print company. You give them the design for a Sukhoi and tell them, please build this. They will do it very well. They will do it. You give them ADA's designed light combat aircraft. They will do a very good job. But if you tell them that, you please go and build a tactical UAV from me within 8 months time, I don't think they will be able to do it because they have tried it and the results have been disastrous. If they had, we would be having a UAV right now. We don't.
One point you brought out in your talk, which is very interesting, is you said this is something for the private sector. But unfortunately, as you also mentioned, in India, everyone is working in little cubicles. Yeah. There is no coordinated infrastructure, as you mentioned. And I think that's the government's job. There should be somebody who will tell, okay, this is the area we need all to work in, and give them the resources to do it.
Yeah. So what happens in
because private sector will not do a coordination job. They are all in it for themselves. Yeah. So they will try to build the thing at the cheapest price, which is probably import materials from China.
Yeah. So So now what is happening is, see, when the UAV sector opened up, everybody and anybody, including a window pane manufacturer, got a JV tied up with some foreign company and called himself a UAV manufacturer. And when the pre-bid meeting took place in Sena Bhavan and everybody, you will see them also. So there was a lot of market sector dilution, I call it, of unwanted players that was happening. These are the same people who start asking various questions and spoil procurement processes also. Now, what has happened, sir, is that in the last 3 or 4 years, there is a lot of selection process that has taken place. That is, only those private sector companies with real capabilities of manufacturing, operation, servicing, are left in the fray or are beginning to be the real players. all the pretenders are now out. Okay. So this is now a real ecosystem of UAV players is emerging in India. That is why I say that if I say that other country is way ahead of us, you know, I say that we have now got a a set of companies that can do the job, okay, that are real UAV players. And when I say UAV, it is not about just manufacturing aerostructures, like not manufacturing the airframe. There is software behind it. There is autopilot behind it. Autopilot is probably the most important thing. Without autopilot, your bird won't fly. It will just fall off. You have ground control stations. You have communication relay, this thing. Some of them can be imported. You don't have to reinvent everything. Then some of them are very good in design. They design their own birds. Some of them are very good in concept of operations. That is, they can think of where UAVs can be used for applications. That in itself is a business. Okay. Then there are people who are doing infrastructure. That is the unmanned traffic management system. That is, you design a software where at any given point of time in an airspace, you can see how many UAVs are flying in the air, and they are able to talk to each other, send the signal to the ATC and say, look, we are around here, don't send an aircraft here. So things of that nature. So that segregation has taken place now, or it is slowly taking place. And this is what I call is a tipping point. You see, once this tipping point happens, then you will see and once this tipping point happens and the regulatory environment, government cannot do much in this. The government can only give you policy facilities, because testing facilities cost a lot of money. So if they can give you testing facilities, regulation, permission to fly, segregate a zone, be it somewhere in Rajasthan in the middle of the Thar desert or something, I don't care. You have a box which is 10 kilometers by 10 kilometers by 10 kilometers. Do whatever you want there, 24/7, 365 days of the year. That's what I need. I would learn the efficacy of my system. What are the kinks in the system, which I need to iron out and make it a robust system.
So you are now working with a organization in Hyderabad where you have activities in the UAE field. Are there similar entities here in Chennai area, in Tamil Nadu?
I am working in Andhra Pradesh, being an aerospace park in Anantapur district, and so my aerospace park is also a testing space for UAV. I have been able to provide that space for UAV to come and test. And as far as is concerned, I think Anna University has got a great program for UAVs. Some really good boys and commendable. Sure about Chennai IIT, Patna University is the place to be.
Okay, thank you.
LVK, some point from me, if there is time. Is he there?
Yeah, he's there.
All right, no problem. Okay, just a few points from my side on your presentation. But also, Mr. Siddharth, if you have the time, you can also go through the chat section. There are some questions which have been posed for you there by some of the people. You will make a note of them and put them all together and respond to it towards the end. So, only a few points from my side.
Yeah.
Because I know you made an observation about UAVs in the Navy. Unfortunately, this morning you saw that some 30 people are affected in Ramanathapuram, the Naval Air Station, Purindu. And that's why they are operating the cannons and the searches from. So it's unfortunate. But again, here is where the fact that it is unmanned, you could perhaps have people sitting in PPEs even if they are affected, but still operating their assets. Because you cannot comprehend any flight at this stage. The force we have our own fleet of UAVs deployed. It's not a big issue. We can, we've done that in the past, even in Kargil, these assets can be relocated depending on the need.
Yes.
You also made an observation about the PA tag. From here, we will have a total asset of 20.
I'm sorry, I had left the meeting by accident. I'm back here.
Indian Army and the Indian Air Force. Even with these border disputes, the kind of sensors that they have has allowed us to fly them along the border areas, and many sorties are being flown today, even as I'm talking to you. On the network control operations and network-centric operations, Indian Navy has taken again a lead, and even the last Malabar exercise was with a network-centric enabled platforms, through our own satellite called the Rukmini, which Dr. Rajesh Senan would be familiar with. So we've come a long way in terms of using the network-centric operations to our advantage, and all the platforms which operated. I'm talking about the air platforms, the surface platform, and the subsurface platforms were all given this kind of a link which was required, which linked them with the project Rukmini, which is nothing but enabling of dialogue at the horizontal and vertical planes with the satellite for cross conversation. So this we already tried out in 2017, and we have come a long way in terms of our ability to be a network-centric capable Navy. Now this has to go on to the rub on to the other services, so that when you are still looking at the theater commands, it becomes an important prerequisite for all your assets in the same theater to be able to talk to each other. There's also, you mentioned about UCAVs. I have a clip here which I just recorded. I don't know if I can show it to you. Otherwise, you can later on look at it. The F-16 which is there has already been converted into a platform. I think I have a 2-minute clip. Let me see if I can show it to you. Let me see. If it doesn't work, then it's a different issue. Yeah, but just to give you an idea of saying that, even the F-16s, which are combat proven or have already been proven to be used as, enemy aircraft in real-time combat. And so this is the kind of future that we have. So if they can be used for target practice, they can also be used like in the UCAVs with better payloads and better integration into the network-centric opportunities. And also, you correctly brought out in your presentation that, they'll be more ideally suited for the 3Ds, the dirty, dangerous, and dumb, tasks, which are perhaps monotonous. It cannot go into, let's say, a nuclear field or a radiologically affected field or something where there is biochemicals which have been used as weapons. Then this is where we can have UCAVs or UAVs of different descriptions. Only one last point from me is about the increased requirement of the Indian Navy to now move forward as far as the underwater UUVs are concerned. China was way ahead of us again. In fact, just 3 months ago, the research vessel which came in from China had deployed up to 7 UUVs which were recovered. You know, they have the capacity to dive up to something like 7 kilometers. So that is 7,000 meters. So, and you know, it dives down to 7,000 meters, is in a position to send the data to the ship which is out there. There's a research vessel, and the research vessel thereafter, using its own satellite terminal, sends processed data, undrawn data, get a complete ocean data, the bathymetric data, you know, salinity, and others, which helps them in designing their weapons and sensors. This becomes an important aspect. So we have a lot to catch up as far as the
Yes,
it was there in the
Siddharth,
night. Sorry.
Siddharth had a question. Yes, Siddharth, please go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah. So we had this in the 70s, so it's only a question of moving forward with modern sensors, weapons, and radio control programs, so that you know, we are up to the task. Thank you. You know, initially we are looking at 3 presentations, but I'm happy we stuck to 1 because it has allowed all of us to you know, explore the entire range of opportunities in the UAV field, and I'm happy that a lot of students are here. As Rajaram has in the chat section has indicated, if some of them are motivated to look at this field, you know, because there are different areas in which they can pick up, you know, in the logistics sector, in the flying sector, on the crew side, on software, on payloads, on sensors, etc., we would have done our job. Back to Mr. L.V. Krishnan.
Thank you.
Please unmute yourself.
I think before TSK, I think Siddharth wanted to say something. Yeah, please go on, Siddharth.
Yeah. No, my only observation is that, you know, this is a sector where we can catch up very quickly. You know, we are not looking for someone to give us the crystal blade technology. You know, many different ways of building a UAVs. You know, many different kinds of UAVs can be built. You know, I don't need your very high sophisticated carbon composite technology. I don't need, you know, weatherization systems. You know, so plenty of things can be done very quickly and very fast. So catch up can be done. And see, the government has to just give me the playing field to do this. Now, when I say talk about weaponization or things of that nature, you know, the DRDL labs, they all should, you know, actively promote kids to come to their ranges. You know, I shouldn't go, they in the policy it says, yeah, you can come to an Air Force range or a you know, DRDO range and test your UAVs. When I go there with my kid, there is a man with a big rifle standing outside the gate. He says, kya chahiye tumko? You know, it's very difficult to get in. Then you have to tell the people, no sir, I've got the permission letter. By the time half a day is gone. So you see, see, this is how you have to. And for example, I'll tell you, when I saw a program on BBC on the Wuhan crisis, it was not about the Wuhan pandemic itself that you know, amazed me. It was they were talking about a robotic arm manufacturing company, and the owner said, you know, we had a big success. The government of China gave me 50 million yuan or $7 million at 0% interest rate. You see, so this is what I'm saying. If you want this sector to go ahead, this is a critical sector because the future systems, transportation systems, evacuation systems, troop insertion systems are going to be hinged on the UAV a lot. Anti-area access denial environment has to be penetrated by a UAV or a underwater system or whatever. Treat it as an important system, and companies that are worth their salt, give them all the room to maneuver, give them all the room to flourish and prosper. Because unless we promote them, you know, they will be stuck in, you know, trying to get bureaucratic approvals and things of that nature. So that has to stop now. It cannot, you have to treat these companies as your favorite companies, and that's what China did. That's why they are ahead of us. It's as simple as that. When it comes to high technology, deserving companies are treated with kid gloves, and they are given everything. Go do it. We'll see. Whether you fail, you fail. That's the risk we are taking, and it doesn't cost a lot of money. And we are not saying that give us $5 billion or something. It's that extra push you need. That's all the young people are asking for. The kids are asking for. Just give us. And see, with great difficulty we were able to get the income, the tax and other things waived off for the startups and things of that nature, make it less complicated. So yes, things are moving forward, but it should move forward at breakneck speed. Now is the time to do it. Let's not just wait back and sit back and say yeah, another 6 months, another budget cycle will come. Do it. Just do everything possible. It's a niche sector, but this niche sector is going to become a common sector. A UAV is going to become an everyday system very soon in the next 20 years. And we have to be up there with the world. We should be exporting these systems to Sri Lanka, Nepal, and all our neighbors. Even if we are not selling it to the US, at least some export market we should capture. That's all.
Great. Anybody
Would
else?
like to ask some question. Would like to ask a question.
Yeah, please go ahead.
This is just thank you, sir. This is for Siddharth, sir. For his presentation is really good, and I learned many things from the presentation. Would like to ask, what is exactly the anti-drone technology or the drone killer technology is about to do? We are procuring more and more or importing more and more of UAVs and drones. And what are the other side of anti-drone technologies you are procuring? What are the countermeasures you are taking in? Because can we think about the 2019 attack on Saudi Arabia of oil fields, or the Iranian attack of US, which makes us think that in daily routine UAV is going to play a major role. What are the anti-drone technology we are going to play, and what are we going to deploy? Can you please throw a light on it so that we could understand more, sir? Thank you.
Yeah. See, anti-drone technology is a very tricky concept. There are these handheld anti-drone devices that are available, which you use to point at a drone, which is invading your privacy or doing something illegal. You can easily bring it down on the ground. Then there are anti-drone devices that are installed in airports where rogue drones can be brought down. But the whole point is that there is a massive risk factor associated with these drone technologies. So as far as the battlefield is concerned, yes, these are effective. But as far as the civilian side is concerned, you have to be very careful. In one experiment which was done in, I think it was in Manchester Airport, most likely, they put a anti-drone device in the airport, and when they turned it on, they just shut off everything, including the radar that was used for the manned aircraft. And nearly 11,000 flights were sort of cancelled or diverted, and it was a big mess. It took them 48 hours to get the airport back online. So yes, this is a very important technology, but again, this technology works on a piecemeal basis. You have to be very careful how you deploy it, and it may not work for all the drones that are there in the air. So that's my two little cents on it. But India, in India, there is a capability for anti-drone technology. I think Bharat Electronics Limited has come up or is working on a system for anti-drones, and I think it's a matter of time then when we have our own system coming into play for this. So yes, in one nutshell, we should have an anti-drone technology in place also.
Can I just add on?
Thank you, sir.
It's a very good talk. Congratulations. I have one question. Where are we with respect to material science side, say carbon composites and all?
As far as carbon composites is concerned, sir, India has got good companies, solid companies that are doing carbon composites. We have carbon composites designed and manufactured from scratch by our National Aerospace Laboratory. They even make the autoclave machines for you. The size, everything you can give them, they will make it for you. If you don't want that, then there are private companies that can supply you with the carbon composite material. What happens with carbon composite material is that if you use it to make drones, cheaper drones, it becomes expensive. Generally, companies tend to prefer glass fiber. It's easier, machine and tooling is easier and cheaper for that. So yes, composites are available, sir. It's not a problem today.
Else? Rajaram?
I just wanted to respond to Vidya's point,
Yeah.
if I can, for just 2 minutes.
Please, please.
On the anti-drone technology, while Mr. Siddharth brought out a lot of other issues, you saw what happened the other day when Pakistan was trying to get something across, arms and ammunition across the border, and it was shut down by the BSF. So, while we can also use a lot of technology, you must have, on a lighter note, have a lot of stones ready with you and throw it at the drones if you see them, because they're very vulnerable. Particularly the quadruples and all that are so vulnerable. The BSF was able to bring it down, and they saw that it was carrying, high-tech weapons, ammunition, grenades, and all this. So this is another danger that we have in the border, where they can quietly sneak in and hand it over to whoever is there using that GPS. So this is the real danger that we need to handle, at least along the borders.
Yes, sir. I would, if I was the commandant of the BSF on the border, I would expect my troops to shoot it down so that they can show their gunnery skills, and I would probably reward them also for doing that, but they should do it in a safe manner so that it doesn't harm anybody. But I think, shooting a rogue drone down is a rather a better effective way of doing it, because it sends a message to the enemy also. They can hear it being brought down. So yes, I think, but I think the BSF is also now looking at anti-drone technology, and Punjab Police is already considering, I think already has purchased, or I'm not sure, some of the anti-drone technologies in place. Most of the heroin that is coming across the border is either thrown simply across the field from the Pakistan side into India, or a lot of it is coming by way of cheap drones. One drone can carry almost up to 8 kgs quadcopter, and it has to just fly 300 meters. So the price of the quadcopter is barely 8,000 rupees, maybe even Pakistani rupees. So it is barely anything compared to the heroin that is on board.
Just a point on this is that maybe we should not have shot it down. We should have tracked it using better technology, see where it goes, who is the handler, allow it to hand over these weapons and nab the entire group. Because you perhaps lost an opportunity to track it and see who it was meant for. That requires another drone to track this and send the real-time pictures and see who's the guy who's receiving these guns. Chaps will be very happy showing off their photos, when thing has been shot down.
Yeah, well, I think so. There's some of them. They are very smart, sir. The people who are handling narcotics, I'm sure they have let some of it pass through also, just to track it back. And these guys know exactly who's involved in it and who's doing it. So I'm sure, sir, they are already networked into that whole system, and they have to see who. It's a big game that goes on. Yeah,
it's a big game. I agree, it's a big game.
If there is nothing else, maybe we should close the meeting. Thanks. Please go ahead, Commodore.
Bye-bye, sir.